The desert plateau of Kalis 4 stretched out in every direction like a sea of pale orange dust. The sky above was a dull purple, and two small suns hung low near the horizon, casting long shadows across the flat ground. Hundreds of seats had been arranged in a wide arc on a raised viewing platform, and in those seats sat the ambassadors, generals, and diplomats of over 40 different alien species. Some were tall and thin with gray skin, others were short and covered in thick fur. A few floated in liquid-filled pods. They had all come here for the same reason. The Verath Dominion had invited them to watch something, and when the Verath invited you, you did not say no. Overseer Palax stood at the front of the platform. He was tall even by Verath standards, nearly 3 meters, with smooth, dark blue skin, and 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across his face. His voice carried across the plateau without any need for amplification. The Verath had engineered their own vocal cords centuries ago to project sound over great distances. It was just one of the many things they liked to remind everyone about. "Friends," Palax said, spreading his long arms wide. "Allies, neighbors, you have all traveled far to be here, and the Dominion thanks you. Today, we do not come to threaten, we come to share, to demonstrate, to show you the reason the Verath have kept this galaxy safe for over 1,000 years. He paused and smiled. It was the kind of smile that said he already knew he had won whatever game he was playing. "Behold," he said, "the Neth Kai." The ground trembled, not from below, but from the air itself. A deep hum rolled across the plateau, and then they appeared. Rising over the far ridge like metal gods, the Verath anti-gravity tanks floated into view. There were 50 of them, arranged in perfect formation, each one the size of a small building. They were smooth, silver, and shaped like flattened teardrops. They had no wheels, no tracks, no legs. They simply floated, hovering 5 meters above the ground as if gravity meant nothing to them. They moved in absolute silence. No engines, no roar. Just that low hum, like the planet itself was afraid of them. The tanks drifted over a river without slowing down. They passed over jagged rocks and deep trenches as if the ground below did not exist. Then, on Palax's signal, the lead tank fired. A beam of bright white energy shot from its front and struck a distant mountain. The top of the mountain simply vanished. Not exploded, not crumbled. It was there, and then it was not. A cloud of dust rose into the purple sky, and the delegates gasped. One by one, the other tanks fired. Mountains split apart. Canyons were carved into flat ground. A lake was boiled dry in seconds. The display lasted 20 minutes, and by the end of it, most of the alien delegates were sitting in stunned silence. A few were trembling. One ambassador from a small insect-like species had fainted. Palax stood at the front and watched their faces with satisfaction. This was exactly the reaction he wanted. Fear, respect, submission. But not everyone was afraid. On the far left side of the viewing platform sat a small group of 5. They wore simple, dark gray uniforms with a blue planet stitched on the chest. They were humans, the youngest spacefaring species in the galactic community. They had only been traveling between stars for about 200 years, which in galactic terms was barely a blink. Most species ignored them. Some pitied them. A few found them amusing. Commander Han Do-hyun sat in the center of the human group. He was a man of average height, with short black hair, and a face that gave away nothing. His eyes watched the Verath tanks carefully, not with fear, but with the calm focus of someone studying a problem. Beside him sat Yun Jia, his chief weapons engineer. She had her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, like she was watching a child show off a toy. Behind them, Tactical Officer Baek Sunho leaned back in his chair and yawned. He did not even try to hide it. Palax noticed. He always noticed. "Commander Do-hyun," Palax called out, his 4 eyes locking onto the human. Every head in the audience turned. I see the human delegation is relaxed. Perhaps your species does not fully understand what you have just witnessed. Do-Yoon stood slowly. He straightened his uniform and looked up at Palex without any expression on his face. We understand perfectly, Overseer, he said. His voice was calm and steady. It was a very impressive display. Impressive, Palex repeated, tasting the word like it was not enough. I have heard that humans still use ground vehicles in warfare. Machines with wheels and tracks that crawl along the dirt like insects. Is this true? A few alien delegates chuckled nervously. Sunho stopped yawning and sat up straight, but Do-Hyun placed a hand on his shoulder without looking back. We use what works, Do-Hyun said simply. Palex laughed. It was a big theatrical laugh designed for the audience. How charming. Perhaps you would like to bring one of your little crawling machines here. Give us a demonstration? I am sure it would be educational. More laughter from the crowd now. The tension was thick, and most species were happy to side with the powerful one in the room. Do-Hyun did not flinch. He looked at Palex for a long moment, then said, We will wait for the proper occasion. The laughter died. Something about the way he said it made the air feel heavier. Palex's smile flickered for just a moment before he recovered and waved his hand dismissively. Very well. The offer stands. The demonstration ended shortly after. The delegates filed out, most of them whispering about the Nethkai tanks and what it meant for their own species. The message was clear. The Verath were the strongest, and everyone else should remember their place. Back on their shuttle, the human team sat in silence for a moment. Then Cheunji, the intelligence analyst, pulled up her screen. She had been monitoring Verath communications throughout the entire event. It is confirmed, she said quietly. This was not just a show. They are preparing a formal territorial demand. 3 of our outer colony systems. They expect us to surrender them within 30 days. Sunho let out a short breath. So the whole exhibition was just a threat wrapped in a party. Obviously, Jia said, without looking up. She was already sketching something on her tablet, her fingers moving fast. The question is not what they want. The question is what we are going to do about it. Everyone looked at Do-Hyun. He sat still for a moment, staring at the wall of the shuttle. Then he pulled out his communicator and typed a single encrypted message to Earth Command. It was short. Only 8 words. They showed us theirs. Get ours ready. He put the communicator away and leaned back in his seat. We are going to say no, he said. And that was the end of the conversation. The message from the Verath Dominion arrived exactly 6 days after the exhibition on Callus 4. It came through every official diplomatic channel at the same time, and it was written in the cold, formal language that the Verath used when they wanted to sound polite while threatening to destroy you. High Marshal Doran, the supreme military commander of the entire Verath Dominion, had signed it personally. The message was simple. Humanity would hand over 3 outer colony systems, Myrung 3, Haewon Station, and the Boral Belt Mining Cluster, within 30 standard galactic days. If they refused, the Verath would take the systems by force, and humanity would learn what the rest of the galaxy had learned long ago. That resistance against the Dominion was not brave, it was stupid. The message ended with a line that Doran clearly thought was generous. We do not wish to harm the young. We wish only to teach them where they stand. On Earth's military station Hammerpoint, which orbited high above the dark side of the moon, Commander Han Do-Hyun read the message 3 times. Then he put it down and looked across the table at his team. 30 days, Sunho said, leaning back in his chair. That is generous of them. It is not generous, Unji said from her seat in the corner. She had dark circles under her eyes, from monitoring alien communications for 6 straight days. 30 days is how long it takes to fully mobilize the Varith First Armored Fleet. They are giving us exactly as much time as they need to prepare their invasion force. If we surrender before that, they save fuel. If we do not, they are ready to move. So the deadline is fake, Sunho said. The deadline is a countdown, Unji corrected. Do-hyun turned to Yoon-jia, who had been standing by the window, staring out at the stars, with her arms crossed. She had not spoken since the meeting started. That usually meant she was thinking about something important. Jia, he said, where are we? She turned around. Her expression was the same one she always wore when she was about to talk about her work. Focused, sharp, and just a little bit proud. Project Jeomchang is ready, she said. The room went quiet. Sunho sat up straight. Even Unji looked up from her screen. Jia walked to the center table and pulled up a holographic display. A three-dimensional image of a machine appeared, rotating slowly in blue light. It was a tank, but not like any tank the galaxy had ever seen. It was massive, low to the ground and built like a fortress on tracks. It had thick angular armor, covered in sensor plates, and mounted on its back was a long, heavy cannon that looked like it could punch a hole through a warship. This is the Jeomchang Mark I, Jia said. Black Spear. It is not an anti-gravity vehicle. It does not fly. It does not hover. It does not float. It sits on the ground, and it makes the ground do what we tell it to. She tapped the display, and the image expanded, showing the internal systems. Every advanced species in this galaxy looked at warfare and asked the same question. How do we get off the ground? How do we fly above the battlefield and strike from the sky? The Varath perfected that idea with the Neth-Kai. Beautiful machines, very impressive. But they all made the same mistake. They forgot about the ground. She pointed to a device built into the belly of the tank. This is the tectonic driver. It sends controlled seismic vibrations into the surface of any planet or moon. With this, we can raise walls of rock in seconds. We can collapse the ground beneath an enemy. We can create shockwaves that travel through the earth and hit targets hundreds of meters away. The battlefield is not just where we fight. The battlefield is our weapon. She pointed to the main cannon. This is a magnetic rail cannon. It fires a solid metal slug at 17 times the speed of sound. No energy beam, no plasma. Just a piece of metal moving so fast that it hits harder than anything the Varath's shields were designed to stop. Their shields are built to absorb energy weapons. They have no answer for raw mass moving at that speed. Finally, she pointed to the tracks. Gravity anchors built into the treads. They grip the planet's surface using localized gravitational manipulation. You cannot flip this tank. You cannot push it. You cannot lift it. It holds onto the ground, like the ground is part of its body. Sunho stared at the hologram for a long moment. You built a tank that uses the planet as a weapon. Yes, Jia said. How many do we have? Do-hyun asked. 40. Fully operational. Crews are trained and ready. It was not a large number. The Varath had thousands of Neth-Kai tanks across their empire. But Do-hyun had not built his career on numbers. He had built it on timing, position, and making the enemy fight on his terms. He turned to Unji. Where will they hit first? Unji pulled up a star map. Mirung 3. It is the closest colony to Varath space, and it is the most valuable of the three systems they demanded. Rocky terrain, mountains, canyons, deep valleys. That is our ground, Sunho said quietly, and a small smile crossed his face. Do-hyun nodded. He stood up and looked at each member of his team. We are going to reject the ultimatum. Officially, publicly, and clearly. No room for misunderstanding. No diplomacy. Just one word. He turned to the communications officer. Send the reply. The message that went back to High Marshal Doran was the shortest diplomatic communication in galactic history. It contained a single word. No. Doran received it in his command chamber, aboard the Vareth flagship Burning Crown. He read it once. He read it twice. Then he set the screen down very slowly and stared at the wall for a long time. In over 800 years of Vareth dominance, no species had ever refused a territorial demand. Some had begged. Some had negotiated. Some had tried to delay. But none had ever simply said no. He called Warden Silith to his chamber. She arrived quickly, tall and armored, with the cold confidence of a career soldier. "Mobilize the first armored fleet," Doran said. His voice was flat and hard. "Full deployment, 200 Nethkai tanks, support ships, and infantry divisions. Target is the human colony designated Mirung 3. Silith bowed her head. "It will be done, High Marshal. How much resistance should we expect?" Doran looked at her. "They are humans," he said. "Ground crawlers. They will resist, and they will fail, and then they will learn." Silith left to prepare. Doran sat alone in his chamber and stared at the single word on his screen. No. Such a small word. Such a foolish word. He would make them regret it. Meanwhile, deep inside Hammerpoint Station, No Tasik climbed into the cockpit of his Jeonchang tank for the 100th time. He was a big man with thick arms and a scarred face, a veteran of 3 colonial wars fought on distant worlds. He had driven tanks since he was 19 years old. He had been shot at, blown up, buried alive, and dragged out of burning wreckage twice. He feared very little. He placed his hands on the controls and felt the machine hum beneath him. The tectonic driver vibrated softly through the floor, like a heartbeat. "They fly," he muttered to himself, running through the simulation data on his screen. Every scenario he had tested against the Nethkai models ended the same way. The anti-gravity tanks were fast and powerful in open air, but the moment the ground turned against them, they fell apart. He smiled and cracked his knuckles. "We make the ground swallow them." The colony world of Mirung 3 was not a beautiful planet. It was a rough, jagged world, covered in gray mountains, deep canyons, and sharp ridges of black rock that stuck out of the ground like broken teeth. The sky was a pale white, and the wind never stopped blowing. The colonists who lived there were miners mostly, tough and quiet people who had chosen this world because it was rich in rare metals and because nobody else wanted it. Now the Varath wanted it, and 200 of their finest anti-gravity tanks were descending from orbit to take it. Warden Silith stood in the command deck of her dropship and watched the surface of Mirung 3 grow larger through the viewing window. The planet looked angry, all stone and shadow, with no flat ground anywhere. She did not like it. Anti-gravity tanks performed best over open terrain, where they could use their speed and altitude freely. This kind of landscape, narrow valleys, unstable ridges, deep gorges, was not ideal. But it did not matter. 200 Nethkai tanks against a species that still used ground crawlers. This would be over before midday. Her tanks touched down on a wide plateau near the northern mountain range and immediately spread into attack formation. They hovered in perfect rows, their silver bodies humming softly, their weapons charged and scanning. Silith gave the order to advance toward the main colony settlement, which sat in a basin between 2 mountain ranges about 40 kilometers to the south. They moved fast. The Nethkai tanks glided over the rocky terrain without effort, rising and dipping with the landscape but never touching it. Scouts flew ahead, scanning for human defenses. They found nothing. No walls, no trenches, no fortifications, no soldiers, no vehicles. Nothing. Silith frowned. "Where are they?" Her sensor officer shook his head. "Nothing on scans, Warden. The colony appears undefended." "That is not possible," Silith said. "They knew we were coming. They rejected our demands. They must have something here." But the scans were clean. The mountains were empty. The valleys were silent. The only movement was the wind pushing dust across the rocks. Silith did not like it, but she had her orders. She pushed forward. The full column of 200 tanks entered a wide canyon basin that cut between the two mountain ranges. It was the fastest route to the colony, and the basin was broad enough for her entire force to move through in a tight formation. What she did not know was that Che Unji had planned for exactly this. Unji had spent 3 weeks preparing Mirung 3. She had leaked false intelligence through channels she knew the Verath were monitoring, suggesting that the colony was lightly defended and that most human forces had been pulled back to protect Earth. The information was designed to make Silith feel confident, to make her move fast and move together, and to lead her straight into the canyon basin. It worked perfectly. 30 kilometers above, in the orbital command ship, Unji watched the Verath formation enter the basin on her tactical display. 200 tanks, packed together in a narrow space between high canyon walls. She turned to Dohyun, who stood beside her. "They are in position," she said. Dohyun nodded once. He opened a channel to the surface. "Tasik, you are clear." Deep inside the mountain on the eastern wall of the canyon, No Tasik sat in the cockpit of his Jeomchang tank and grinned. Around him, 24 other Jeomchang tanks waited in hidden tunnels that had been carved into the rock over the past 2 weeks. Their engines were cold. Their systems were dark. They had been sitting in silence, like sleeping giants, waiting for this exact moment. "All units," Tasik said into his communicator. "Tectonic drivers to full power. On my mark." He placed his hands on the controls. The tank hummed to life beneath him, and he felt the tectonic driver begin to vibrate, sending a deep pulse into the rock below. Mark. 25 tectonic drivers activated at the same time. The effect was immediate and devastating. The ground inside the canyon basin began to move. Not shake, move. The flat stone floor cracked and buckled. Massive slabs of rock rose up from below, like the teeth of some enormous creature closing its mouth. The canyon walls groaned and shifted inward, narrowing the space. The earth heaved and rolled in waves, as if the planet itself had woken up and was angry. The Verath tanks were hovering 5 meters above the ground. When the ground beneath you rises 10 meters in 2 seconds, your hover height means nothing. Tanks were thrown sideways, as pillars of stone erupted beneath them. Stabilizers screamed and failed. Tanks collided with each other, their smooth silver hulls crashing together with terrible sounds of tearing metal. Some were flipped completely over. Others were driven into the canyon walls by the shifting rock. Silith grabbed the railing of her command tank as it spun wildly. Alarms filled the air. Her formation, her perfect, beautiful formation, was falling apart in seconds. "What is happening?" she screamed. "Seismic activity," her officer shouted. The ground is being manipulated. This is not natural." Before she could respond, the mountain walls on both sides of the canyon split open, and the Jeomchang tanks rolled out. They were nothing like the Nethkai. They were ugly, heavy, brutal machines. They did not float. They did not glide. They crawled forward on massive armored tracks, low to the ground, covered in scarred metal plates and sensor arrays. They looked like they had been built to survive the end of the world. And they hit like it too. The first volley of magnetic rail cannon fire tore across the canyon basin. The slugs moved so fast they were invisible, just streaks of superheated air, followed by the sound of impact. They struck the Verath tanks and went straight through them. The energy shields that protected the Nethkai were designed to stop plasma bolts and laser beams. They had no answer for a solid piece of metal moving at 17 times the speed of sound. The shields flickered and did nothing. The slugs punched through armor, through systems, through everything. Tank after tank exploded, the canyon filled with fire and smoke, and the screaming of metal being torn apart. Verath crews tried to return fire, but their targeting systems were going crazy from the seismic interference. Shots went wide, hitting canyon walls or empty air. The few beams that did find their targets splashed against the thick angular armor of the Jiamchang tanks and did surprisingly little damage. Jia had designed the armor specifically to deflect energy weapons, angling every plate to scatter beam energy across the surface, instead of absorbing it at a single point. Tasik drove his tank straight into the chaos. His crew fired again and again, each rail cannon shot finding a target. Around him, the other Jiamchang tanks advanced in a steady line, their tectonic drivers still active, still churning the ground beneath the Verith formation. Every time a Verith tank tried to rise higher to escape the terrain, a gravity pulse from a tectonic driver would pull it back down into the mess. Silith managed to rally a group of 30 tanks and tried to break out of the basin to the north. He activated a focused seismic burst directly in their path, and the ground ahead of them collapsed into a trench 20 meters deep. The tanks tried to stop, but could not. 12 of them fell into the trench. The rest scattered. The battle lasted 38 minutes. When it was over, 63 Verath tanks were destroyed. Another 40 were too damaged to fight. The rest of Silith's force broke formation and retreated to orbit in a disordered, humiliated mess. It was the worst single defeat the Verath military had suffered in over 300 years. Silith made it out alive, but just barely. Her command tank had taken 2 rail cannon hits that had torn through the rear compartments. She sat in her damaged vehicle as it limped back to the fleet, staring at her tactical display in silence. 200 Nethkai tanks, the pride of the Dominion, beaten by 25 machines that could not even fly. On the surface of Mirong 3, the canyon basin was a graveyard of burning silver wreckage. The wind carried black smoke across the mountains. Do-hyun stood at the mouth of one of the mountain tunnels and looked out at the destruction. Sun-ho stood beside him, unusually quiet. Jia was already on her communicator, coordinating repairs and gathering data from the battle. "Send the after-action report," Do-hyun said calmly. "Full footage, complete data. Send it to every species that attended the exhibition on Callus 4. Sun-ho looked at him. "All of them?" "All of them," Do-hyun said. "Let them see what ground crawlers can do." The footage hit the Galactic Communication Network like a bomb. Within 2 days of the battle at Mirong 3, every major species in the galaxy had seen it. Unji had made sure of that. She had not just sent the official after-action report to the governments and military commands. She had also quietly leaked the raw battlefield footage to independent news networks, trading stations, and public information boards across dozens of systems. She knew that official reports could be buried or ignored. But raw footage of 200 Verath anti-gravity tanks being torn apart by machines that rolled on tracks, that was impossible to ignore. The video spread faster than anything in recent galactic memory. It showed everything. The Verath tanks entering the canyon in their perfect formation, the ground rising beneath them like a living thing, the silver tanks spinning and crashing into each other like toys. And then the Jiamchang tanks rolling out of the mountains, ugly and heavy and unstoppable, firing their rail cannons and turning the most feared military machines in the galaxy into burning wreckage. The reaction was immediate. On the trading world of Fenris Station, a group of alien merchants watched the footage on a large screen in the main market hall. When the first Verath tank was punched through by a rail cannon slug, the hall went completely silent. When the battle ended and the Verath retreated, someone in the back of the crowd said, "That is not possible." But it was possible. They had just watched it happen. On the homeworld of the Polari Collective, a peaceful species of tall, thin beings who had been paying tribute to the Verath for 2 centuries, the government held an emergency meeting. For the first time in their history, they discussed the idea of refusing their next tribute payment. They did not make a decision that day, but the fact that they discussed it at all was a revolution. On a dozen other worlds, the reaction was the same: shock, disbelief, and then, slowly, something that had not existed in the galaxy for a very long time: hope. Hope that the Verath were not invincible. Hope that the order of things could change, and in the middle of all of it, Overseer Palax was finished. The diplomat who had stood on that platform on Callus 4 and mocked the humans in front of the entire galactic community was now the biggest joke in known space. Someone had edited the footage from the exhibition. His speech about Verath's superiority, his laughter at the humans, his question about their crawling machines, and placed it side by side with the footage from Miron 3. The contrast was devastating. On one side, Palax laughing. On the other side, Verath tanks burning. It played in bars, on trading ships, in government offices. Species that had been afraid to even whisper criticism of the Verath were now openly sharing it. Palax was recalled to the Verath homeworld in disgrace. His political career was over. He would spend the rest of his life being remembered as the fool who laughed at the species that broke the Dominion's winning streak. But High Marshal Doran was not laughing. He was not embarrassed. He was not panicking. He was thinking. Doran was not like Palax. He was not a showman or a diplomat. He was a soldier, old and hard, with scars across his face from battles fought before most of the current Verath leadership was born. He had built the Dominion's military into the force it was today, and he did not believe that one lost battle meant the war was over. He sat in his private command chamber aboard the Burning Crown and reviewed the footage from Miron 3, frame by frame. He analyzed their movement patterns, their rate of fire, their armor composition. He noted their weaknesses. They were slow. They needed solid ground to operate, and there were very few of them. His scouts reported that the humans had fewer than 50 of these machines in total. 50 tanks. That was all. Doran made his decision. He would not send another 200 tanks. He would send everything. The Verath Grand Armada, 1,000 Nethkai tanks, 300 support ships, 80,000 infantry soldiers, and a full orbital bombardment wing. He would not fight on the humans' terms. He would overwhelm them with numbers so great that no amount of clever engineering could save them. He would bomb their positions from orbit first, flatten the terrain so their seismic weapons had nothing to work with, and then send in wave after wave of tanks until the humans were buried. He set the staging ground at the moon of Callus 4, the same world where the exhibition had been held. It would take 3 weeks to fully assemble the armada there. 3 weeks, and then the humans would learn that one victory did not make them a power. On Hammerpoint Station, Unji intercepted the mobilization orders within hours. She brought them to Dohyun's command room, where the full team had gathered. Her face was grim. 1,000 tanks, she said, plus orbital bombardment capability, full infantry support. They are assembling everything at Callus 4's moon. The room was quiet. Sunho broke the silence. 40 tanks against 1,000. Even with the terrain advantage, that is not a fight we can win on defense. She had run the numbers already. He is right. If they bomb the surface first and flatten the mountains, we lose our biggest advantage. The tectonic drivers need complex terrain to be effective. On flat ground, they can still work, but the effect is reduced by half. And against 1,000 tanks with orbital support, she trailed off and shook her head. So we cannot defend, Dohyun said. It was not a question. He was already thinking ahead. No, Sunho said, and then he leaned forward, and there was a light in his eyes that the others recognized. It was the look he got when he had a terrible idea that might actually work. But we can attack. Everyone looked at him. Their armada is not ready yet, Sun Ho continued. They need 3 weeks to assemble at Kalas 4's moon. Right now their forces are arriving in pieces. Half the tanks are not powered up. Supply lines are still being established. The staging ground is a construction zone, not a fortress. Do-hyun understood immediately. You want to hit them before they are ready. I want to drop 40 Jiangcheng tanks directly onto their staging ground from orbit and break their armada before it ever launches, Sun Ho said. They are expecting us to sit on our colony and wait for them to come to us. They are not expecting us to come to them. It is insane, Unji said flatly. Yes, Sun Ho agreed. That is why it will work. The room was silent again. Jia stared at the star map, calculating trajectories in her head. Unji pulled up intelligence on the Kalas 4 moon's surface. Rocky, unstable crust, rich in mineral deposits, good ground for tectonic drivers. Do-hyun looked at each of them. These were the people he trusted most in the universe. A brilliant engineer who could turn a planet into a weapon. An intelligence analyst who could see through walls. A tactical officer who thought like a madman. And down in the hangar, a tank pilot who was afraid of nothing. Prepare the drop pods, he said. All 40 Jiangcheng tanks, full combat load. Sun Ho smiled. Inji sighed. Jia was already pulling up the engineering specifications for orbital drop deployment. 3 decks below, No Taesik received the orders on his personal communicator. He read them twice, then laughed once, a short, hard sound that echoed through the empty hangar. He climbed into his tank and began running system checks. Around him, the other 39 Jiangcheng tanks stood in rows, massive and dark and silent, waiting to fall from the sky. Taesik placed his hands on the controls and felt the familiar hum of the tectonic driver beneath his feet. 40 tanks against an empire, he said to no one. The drop pods fell like meteors. 40 armored shells, each one carrying a 60-ton Jiangcheng tank and its crew, tore through the thin atmosphere of Kalas 4's moon and slammed into the surface at terrible speed. The impacts were not soft. They were not quiet. Each pod hit the ground with the force of a small explosion, sending shockwaves across the rocky plain and throwing up towers of dust and debris that rose 100 meters into the sky. The Veroth staging ground was spread across a wide, flat basin on the moon's northern hemisphere. It was a massive military camp. Rows of docked anti-gravity tanks, fuel depots, ammunition stores, communication towers, infantry barracks, and supply ships lined up in neat rows, like a city built for war. At the center of it all sat the command complex, where High Marshal Doran was personally overseeing the assembly of his Grand Armada. He was reviewing fleet readiness reports when the first impact shook the building. The lights flickered. His drink fell off the table. Before he could speak, the second impact hit, then the third, then 40 impacts in less than 10 seconds, spread across the entire length of the staging ground. Alarms screamed to life. Officers ran to their stations, screens filled with damage reports and sensor warnings. Doran pushed through the chaos to the main tactical display and stared at what he saw. 40 objects had struck the surface of his staging ground. They were not bombs. They were not missiles. As the dust cleared, his cameras showed armored shapes rising out of craters, shedding their drop pod shells like insects breaking out of cocoons. Heavy machines, low and dark, with thick tracks and long cannons, pulling themselves onto the surface and beginning to move. Impossible, Doran whispered. It was not impossible. It was happening. Taesik's Jiangcheng tank was the first to clear its crater. His drop had landed directly between 2 fuel depots, and the impact alone had ruptured both of them. Rivers of liquid fuel were already burning across the ground, sending walls of flame into the Veroth's supply lines. He did not waste a second. Before the dust had even settled, He activated his tectonic driver and sent a seismic pulse rippling outward through the moon's crust. The moon of Callus 4 had a thin, unstable crust sitting on top of dense mineral deposits. Gia had chosen this target partly for that reason. When Tasik's tectonic driver hit the ground, the effect was dramatic. The surface cracked in long, jagged lines, radiating outward from his position. Underground hangars that stored hundreds of Verith tanks collapsed inward as the rock above them gave way. Supply tunnels caved in. Communication towers tilted and fell. The ground itself was coming apart. All around the staging ground, 24 other Jeonchang tanks were doing the same thing. 25 tectonic drivers hit the moon's crust simultaneously, and the effect was devastating. The entire basin shuddered and groaned like a dying animal. Cracks spread in every direction. Geysers of dust and crushed rock erupted from below. Buildings collapsed. Ships that were sitting on landing pads tilted and slid into newly formed trenches. Verath soldiers ran in every direction, trying to reach their tanks, trying to find their officers, trying to understand what was happening. But there was nothing to understand. The ground was eating their base alive. Doran recovered faster than most. He was old, but he was not slow. He screamed orders into his communicator, directing every operational tank to launch immediately. About 300 Nethkai tanks managed to power up and lift off from their pads before the ground beneath them collapsed. They rose into the air in a disorganized swarm, their weapons spinning, looking for targets. Now the real battle began. Yunjia was watching everything from the human command ship in orbit above the moon. She had spent the last week preparing for this exact scenario. On her screen, she could see every Jeonchang tank, every Varath tank, every building and crater and fire. She began calling targets. Tasik, 3 tanks rising to your east, 200 meters. Sunho Squadron, focus fire on the command complex perimeter. All units, synchronized volley in 10 seconds. The Jeonchang tanks responded as one. 10 seconds later, 40 rail cannons fired in a single coordinated volley. 40 hypersonic slugs crossed the battlefield in the blink of an eye and struck 40 different targets. Varath tanks that had just risen off the ground were hit mid-air and thrown backward in pieces. The rail cannon slugs did not care about shields. They did not care about armor. They were simple pieces of metal, moving at speeds that turned them into the most destructive force on the battlefield. The volley tore a hole through the center of the Varath formation. Burning wreckage rained down across the staging ground. Doran watched from his command center as his forces died. But the Varath were not finished. 300 tanks were still in the air, and Warden Sylith was among them. She had survived Neuron 3, and she had learned from it. She was not going to make the same mistakes twice. All units, gain altitude, she ordered. Get above their seismic range. Spread formation. Do not cluster. Target their tracks and treads. If they cannot move, they cannot fight. It was a smart order. The Varath tanks rose higher, spreading out across the sky like silver birds, and began firing down at the Jeonchang tanks from above. Energy beams rained down onto the human formation. Jia's angled armor deflected most of the shots. A Jeonchang tank on the western flank took a direct hit to its tread system and ground to a halt. Another was struck from 3 sides at once, and its armor finally gave way, the tank splitting open in a burst of fire and metal. The crew did not survive. Tasik gritted his teeth as he watched the losses on his screen. 2 tanks down, then 3. The Varath were adapting, and altitude gave them an advantage the Jeonchang tanks could not easily answer. But Tasik had an answer. All drivers focus pulse, upward he called, pull them down. The tectonic drivers could do more than shake the ground. At full power, focused into a tight beam, they could create a localized gravity distortion, a sudden increase in gravitational pull in a small area directly above the tank. It was not true gravity manipulation. It was a seismic trick, using the vibration of dense mineral deposits beneath the surface to create a momentary pull effect. It lasted only a few seconds, but a few seconds was enough. Across the battlefield, Jiangchang tanks aimed their tectonic drivers upward and fired focused pulses at the hovering Vareth tanks above them. The effect was immediate. Vareth tanks that were hovering at 50 meters suddenly dropped to 20. Their anti-gravity engines screamed as they fought the pull. Some recovered, some did not. Those that dropped low enough were in rail cannon range, and the Jiangcheng crews did not miss. Silet's tank was caught in one of the pulses. Her vehicle lurched downward, and for a terrible second she thought she was going to crash into the surface. Her pilot managed to recover at the last moment, pulling the tank back up to safe altitude, but the experience shook her. These human machines were not just strong, they were creative. Every time the Vareth found an answer, the humans found a new question. The battle raged for over an hour. It was brutal and ugly and loud. The staging ground was unrecognizable, a churned, burning wasteland of craters, wreckage, and collapsed structures. 7 Jiangcheng tanks were destroyed. Their crews died inside them, fighting until the end. But the Vareth losses were catastrophic. Over 200 tanks destroyed. The fuel reserves were gone. The ammunition stores were gone. The supply ships were burning. The Grand Armada, which was supposed to be the force that crushed humanity forever, was broken before it ever left the ground. Do-hyun had watched the entire battle from orbit. When the moment was right, he ordered his own command tank drop to the surface. It landed near the Vareth command complex, and he rolled forward through the smoke and fire until he was within direct communication range of Doran's position. He opened an open channel. Every Vareth and human on the battlefield could hear him. "Hi, Marshal Doran," Do-hyun said. His voice was calm, the way it always was. "Your machines defy the ground. Ours command it. This is over." There was a long silence. Doran stood in his ruined command center, surrounded by broken screens and fallen officers. Outside, the last of his operational tanks were retreating to orbit. His armada was finished. His staging ground was a graveyard. His 1,000-tank invasion force had been killed in its cradle by 40 machines that could not even fly. He closed his eyes. He had fought wars for over 200 years. He had never lost. Until today. He reached for his communicator and activated the general broadcast. "All Vareth forces, cease fire. Stand down." The guns went quiet. The tectonic drivers powered down. The dust began to settle. For the first time in its 800-year history, the Vareth Dominion formally requested terms from a younger species. The Galactic Summit was held 4 weeks later on a neutral station in deep space. Representatives from every major species attended. The Vareth delegation was small and quiet. They agreed to withdraw all territorial claims against humanity and signed a non-aggression pact that recognized Earth as a sovereign power, equal in standing to the Dominion. Do-hyun attended as humanity's military representative. He wore his simple gray uniform and said very little. He did not need to. Everyone in the room had seen the footage. After the signing, a group of alien diplomats approached the human delegation. They were curious, as everyone was, about the same question. "How?" asked the Polari ambassador, a tall, thin being who had spent his entire life under Vareth's shadow. "Your species is young. You have fewer ships, fewer soldiers, fewer resources. How did you defeat their technology?" Do-hyun looked at Sunho. Sunho looked at Jia. They all turned to Sunho, because they knew he had been waiting for someone to ask. Sunho smiled, the same easy grin he always wore when the pressure was heaviest. "You all looked at the sky," he said. "We looked at the ground. Turns out the ground hits harder." The Polari ambassador stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he began to laugh. Others joined in. It was the kind of laughter that came from relief, from the sudden release of centuries of fear. Far away on the surface of Mirong 3, the colony was rebuilding. Miners went back to work. Children went back to school. The mountains still stood, scarred from the battle but unbroken. And in a hangar on Hammer Point Station, No Tasik sat on the hull of his battered, scorched, dented Geomchong tank and ate his lunch in silence. The machine beneath him was ugly, heavy, and covered in the marks of war. It could not float, but it had won. Across the galaxy, military academies began rewriting their textbooks. Engineering departments started new research programs. Governments that had trembled before the Verath began to stand a little straighter. The age of anti-gravity supremacy, the doctrine that had ruled galactic warfare for 1,000 years, was over. Something new had taken its place. Something heavy, something stubborn, something human. The age of the ground had begun.